How could a nephew abandon his own uncle to perish in this strange city? An uncle who had always acted as a father after the nephew was abandoned by his own mother. And the reason was the saddest. He wanted to live a life of luxury using his retirement money. But look how life turns around, and everyone gets what they deserve. The sun was setting over the skyscrapers of Boston, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. On a busy corner, an elderly man with gray hair and tattered clothes looked around, confused and disoriented. This was Frank Thompson, a 78-year-old man who, just a few hours ago, had been living peacefully in his small home in the suburbs of Chicago. Frank was shivering slightly, not only from the autumn chill setting in, but from the shock of finding himself alone in an unfamiliar city. His blue eyes, blurred with age, scanned the building facades, searching for something familiar, anything that might give him a clue about where he was or how he got there. "Hey, sir, are you okay?" A young woman with red hair approached, noticing Frank's lost expression. I don't know where I am," Frank replied, his voice trembling. "My nephew, Jake. He brought me out for a surprise. But now I can't find him anywhere." The woman, Sarah Miller, felt a pang of concern. "Sir, you're in Boston. Are you sure your nephew didn't plan to meet you somewhere specific?" Frank shook his head, tears starting to form in his eyes. "No, he just left me here and said he'd be back soon. It's been hours." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "Look, it's getting late. How about we go to the police station? They might be able to help find your nephew." Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Chicago, Jake Thompson sat contentedly in the house that had once belonged to his uncle. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Matt, it's all set. Old Frank is out of the picture. I left him in Boston with no papers, no money. With his age and poor health, I doubt he'll last more than a few weeks on the streets." On the other end of the line, Matt, Jake's friend, responded hesitantly. "Man, are you sure about this? I mean, he raised you—" Jake cut him off abruptly. "So what? He served his purpose. Now it's my turn to enjoy. With his pension and this house, I can finally live the life I deserve." Back in Boston, Frank followed Sarah to the nearest police station, his heart heavy with the terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. He didn't want to believe that Jake, the boy he had raised like a son, could have abandoned him like this. But as the hours passed and the reality of his situation became clearer, Frank felt a growing determination inside him. "I don't know how," he murmured to himself, "but I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to find out what really happened." The first rays of sunlight had barely touched the horizon when Frank Thompson was already up, putting on his worn work boots. His body ached, but his determination remained unshaken. He stepped out of the small cabin behind the Greenfield farm, where he had been working and living for nearly 2 years since being abandoned in Boston. "Good morning, Frank. Up so early," greeted Mary Dawson, the farm's owner, a 65-year-old widow who had taken Frank in when he needed it most. "Morning, Mary. The work doesn't wait, you know," Frank replied with a tired but genuine smile. As he walked toward the barn, Frank couldn't help but think about how his life had changed. Greenfield Farm had become his refuge and new home. Despite the hardships, he had found a purpose there, tending to the land and animals with the same love and dedication he once gave to the nephew who betrayed him. In the barn, Frank started milking the cows, talking softly to them. "You know, Bessie, sometimes I wonder how Jake is spending my retirement now. I hope he's at least enjoying it." Meanwhile, thousands of miles away at a luxury resort in Miami, Jake Thompson was lounging on a poolside chaise, a pricey drink in hand. "Hey, waiter, another one of these, please, and put it on the room tab." Jake smiled, thinking about how his life had improved over the past 2 years. Trips, parties, expensive clothes, all thanks to Uncle Frank's retirement money. A twinge of guilt hit him momentarily, but he quickly brushed it aside. The old man must be long gone by now, he thought. At least his money's being well spent. Back at Greenfield Farm, Frank was finishing up feeding the chickens when he noticed one of them seemed ill. "Come here, little one, let me take a look at you," he murmured, gently picking up the chicken. With care and patience, he examined the bird, identifying the problem and starting treatment. Mary watched from afar, admiring Frank's dedication. She approached with a mug of hot coffee. "Frank, you have a gift with these animals. I've never seen anyone care for them with so much love. Frank took the coffee gratefully. Oh, Mary, these little critters are all I have now. Each one of them is special to me. As they talked, the sound of a car approaching caught their attention. It was the mailman bringing the month's mail. Mary went to greet him, returning with a handful of envelopes. Frank, there's a letter here from the Social Security Department. Do you want me to read it for you? Mary asked, knowing about Frank's difficulties with reading due to his weakened eyesight. Please, Mary, Frank replied, his heart racing with a mix of hope and apprehension. Mary opened the envelope and began to read. As the words came out, Frank's eyes widened. The department had noticed irregularities in his retirement withdrawals and was investigating the case. Frank, this could be good. Maybe we can recover your retirement funds, Mary exclaimed, hopeful. Frank nodded slowly, a whirlwind of emotions in his chest. Part of him wanted justice, to see Jake pay for what he had done. But another part, the part that still loved the nephew he had raised, felt torn. Let's see what happens, Mary. For now, we still have a lot of work to do here, Frank replied, turning his attention back to the sick chicken in his arms. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Frank continued his day on the farm, caring for each animal, each plant, with the same love and dedication as always. Despite the hardships, the pain, and the betrayals of the past, his heart remained full of kindness, and his spirit unwavering in its strength. Autumn had arrived in Boston, painting the streets with golden and red hues. Frank Thompson walked through the local park, enjoying a rare day off from the farm. Despite the hardships, the pain, and the betrayals of the past, his heart remained full of kindness, and his spirit unwavering in its strength. Autumn had arrived in Boston, painting the streets with golden and red hues. Frank Thompson walked through the local park, enjoying a rare day off from the farm. His steps led him to a wooden bench by a small pond, where a middle-aged woman was sitting, gazing thoughtfully at the water. Excuse me, is this seat taken? Frank asked gently. The woman looked up, her brown eyes meeting Frank's. No, please, sit down, she replied with a tired smile. Frank sat down, noticing the concerned expression on the woman's face. Is everything all right, ma'am? She sighed. Not exactly. I'm Evelyn Cartwright. I just came from a medical appointment and the news wasn't the best. I'm sorry to hear that, Frank said sincerely. I'm Frank Thompson. I know how hard it can be to face health problems alone. Evelyn looked at Frank with curiosity. You speak as if you have experience. Frank nodded, and before he knew it, he was telling his story to this stranger. He talked about Jake, the abandonment, the 2 years working on the farm. Evelyn listened attentively, her eyes filling with compassion. Frank, that's terrible. How do you manage to move forward with such strength? Evelyn asked, amazed. Frank smiled softly. One day at a time, Mrs. Cartwright, and with the help of good people I've met along the way. In the months that followed, Frank and Evelyn met regularly in the park. Evelyn, a successful businesswoman in the tech industry, found in Frank a source of strength and inspiration to deal with her own breast cancer diagnosis. Frank, in turn, found in Evelyn a confidant and friend. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. Evelyn helped Frank navigate the legal system to try to recover his retirement funds, while Frank supported her through her cancer treatment. On a sunny spring afternoon, as they walked through the park where they had first met, Evelyn suddenly stopped. Frank, I think I'm in love with you, she confessed, her cheeks blushing. Frank was surprised, but a wide smile spread across his face. Evelyn, dear, I think I'm in love with you too. 6 months later, the park was the setting for a beautiful wedding ceremony. Frank, dressed in a simple but elegant suit, and Evelyn, radiant in an ivory dress, exchanged vows in front of their friends, including Mary from the Greenfield farm. I, Frank, take you, Evelyn, as my wife. I promise to love and support you, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, Frank said, his voice choked with emotion. Evelyn, tears of joy in her eyes, responded, And I, Evelyn, take you, Frank, as my husband. I promise to stand by your side always, facing any challenge that life may bring. After the wedding, Frank moved into Evelyn's home and, to his surprise, became a co-owner of her company. At first, he felt out of place in the corporate world, but his wisdom and life experience soon proved valuable to the business. One night, while they were having dinner at home, Evelyn set her utensils aside and looked seriously at Frank. "Darling, I think it's time we resolve the situation with Jake once and for all." Frank frowned. "What do you mean, Evelyn?" Evelyn took Frank's hand. "We're going to recover your retirement funds and make Jake pay for what he did. I have the best lawyers at our disposal. It's time to seek justice." Frank was silent for a moment, considering the proposal. Part of him still hesitated to take action against the nephew he had raised, but he knew Evelyn was right. Finally, he nodded. "You're right, dear. It's time to correct this wrong." Evelyn smiled, squeezing Frank's hand. "We'll get through this together, my love. And when it's all resolved, how about a trip? I've always wanted to show you Paris." Frank laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Paris? Well, why not? With you by my side, Evelyn, I feel like I can do anything." As the couple planned their future, determination shone in both of their eyes. Frank's journey was far from over, but now, with Evelyn by his side, he felt ready to face any challenge that came their way. The law office in downtown Boston was buzzing with activity when Thomas Cartwright, Evelyn's brother and a renowned lawyer, leaned over a stack of documents related to Frank Thompson's case. "Thomas, how are we doing with Frank's case?" Evelyn asked, entering her brother's office with a cup of coffee in hand. Thomas looked up, excitement gleaming in his eyes. "Evelyn, I think we found something big." "Really big?" He spent the next few minutes explaining his discovery at the property office. Frank's house in Chicago had been sold without his knowledge, with a signature that couldn't possibly be his. "But how is that possible? Frank was here in Boston on that date, working on the farm," Evelyn exclaimed, shocked. "Exactly," Thomas replied, his voice low. "It all points to Jake, the nephew, forging the signature to sell the house. It's the proof we needed to expose him once and for all." Evelyn sat down, processing the information. "What do we do now?" Thomas stood up, determined. "I'm taking this evidence straight to the police. It's time for Jake to face the consequences of his actions." That afternoon, Detective John Harris welcomed Thomas into his office at the Boston police station. As the lawyer presented the evidence, the detective's face grew increasingly serious. "This is serious, Mr. Cartwright." "Very serious," the detective said, examining the documents. "I'll notify the property office immediately and issue an arrest warrant for Jake Thompson." In Chicago, Jake Thompson was enjoying an expensive lunch at a fancy restaurant when his phone rang. It was Amanda Peterson, the woman who had bought his uncle's house. "Jake, what the hell is going on?" "The property office just informed me that the sale of the house has been canceled," Amanda shouted over the phone. "What?" "That's impossible," Jake responded, a chill running down his spine. "Then you'd better sort this out quickly or I'm going to sue you for every last cent," Amanda threatened before hanging up. Stunned, Jake went straight to the Chicago property office. He had barely entered the building when two police officers approached him. "Jake Thompson," one of the officers asked. "Yes, that's me," Jake stammered. "You're under arrest for fraud and document forgery," the officer declared, cuffing Jake. As he was led away, Jake watched his world crumble. How could this happen? How did his uncle, whom he believed was dead, manage to uncover everything? Back in Boston, Frank and Evelyn received the news of Jake's arrest with a mix of relief and sadness. "It's over, dear," Evelyn said softly, holding Frank's hand. Frank nodded, tears in his eyes. "I never wanted it to come to this, Evelyn. He was like a son to me." Evelyn embraced her husband tenderly. "I know, my love, but now we can move on. Your house is back. Your retirement will be restored. We can finally plan our future without this shadow hanging over us." Frank smiled sadly. "You're right, as always. You know, I think I'm ready for that trip to Paris now." Evelyn laughed, kissing her husband's cheek. "Paris awaits us, my dear Frank." As the couple began to plan their trip, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The betrayal from Jake still stung, but with Evelyn by his side and justice served, he knew he could finally move forward. Life had given him a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. The afternoon sun bathed the streets as a taxi pulled up in front of Evelyn and Frank's house. A middle-aged woman stepped out, with features familiar to Frank. It was Elena, his long-lost sister. "Elena, what are you doing here?" Evelyn exclaimed, opening the door, surprised and a bit apprehensive. "I need to talk to Frank. It's about my son, Jake," Elena replied, her voice trembling with worry. Evelyn hesitated, remembering the conversation she had had with Frank about possible emotional manipulation. "I'm not sure this is a good idea, Elena. Frank has been through so much." "Please, Evelyn, I'm the only family he has," Elena pleaded. At that moment, Frank appeared in the entryway. "Elena!" he called, his voice a mix of surprise and restrained emotion. "Frank, a brother!" Elena rushed to hug him, tears streaming down her face. "Please, you need to help Jake. I know he made mistakes, but he's my son, your nephew." Frank was silent for a moment, his eyes meeting Evelyn's, who watched him with concern. Finally, he spoke. "Elena, what Jake did was very serious, but he is family. I can help him, with one condition." "Anything, Frank." "Anything?" Elena responded quickly. "He needs to return all the money from my retirement that he spent, and then both of you need to leave. Start over somewhere else," Frank declared firmly. Elena nodded, relieved. Yes, we'll do that. Thank you, Frank, thank you." At the police station, Detective John Harris greeted them with surprise. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't expect to see you here so soon." Frank explained the situation, signing the necessary documents to withdraw the complaint. The detective, though reluctant, accepted the terms. Jake was brought from the cell, looking dejected and frightened. Seeing Frank, his eyes filled with tears. "Uncle, I'm so sorry. I really am." Frank looked him in the eyes. "Jake, what you did was terrible, but I'm willing to give you a second chance." Jake dropped to his knees, sobbing. "I just wanted a better life, you know? After Mom left me, I felt so lost. My friends told me I deserved more, that I should live life to the fullest. I was a fool." Frank placed his hand on his nephew's shoulder. "I understand your pain, Jake, but our choices define who we are. You have a chance to make things right now." "I will, Uncle, I promise. I'll work hard. I'll pay back every cent," Jake promised, wiping away his tears. Evelyn, who had been silently observing, approached Frank. "Are you sure about this, dear?" she whispered. Frank nodded. "Everyone deserves a second chance, my love. That's what you taught me." As they left the police station, the group formed an unusual picture. Frank and Evelyn holding hands, Elena hugging Jake protectively, all walking together under the setting sun of Boston. "Let's go home," Frank said. "We have a lot to talk about and plan." As they walked, Frank reflected on the twists of his life, from being abandoned to becoming a forgiver, from victim to mentor. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Evelyn by his side and the chance to reconnect with his family, he felt ready to face any challenge. The sun had barely risen when Jake Thompson, dressed in simple work clothes, stepped out of the small cabin behind the Greenfield farm. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now carried a mix of determination and humility. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh morning air, and headed toward the barn. "Good morning, Jake," Mary Dawson greeted him with a warm smile. "Ready for another day?" "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson." "Always ready," Jake replied, grabbing a bucket to start milking. The months on the farm had transformed Jake. His once soft hands were now calloused from hard work. His sun-bronzed face bore lines of expression that hadn't been there before. Not from worry, but from a newfound understanding of life. Every penny Jake earned, he faithfully gave to Frank. At first, the temptation to keep some for himself was strong, but over time, he began to understand the value of honest work and redemption. On a Sunday afternoon, after months of work, Frank and Evelyn came to visit the farm. They found Jake in the field, helping to repair a fence. "Jake, my boy!" Frank called out, his voice gentle. "Uncle Frank, Mrs. Evelyn!" Jake exclaimed, dropping his tools and running to greet them. Frank watched his nephew with keen eyes. "I see that the farm work has done you good, Jake." "It's been a transformative experience, Uncle," Jake admitted, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I never imagined that working like this could teach me so much." Evelyn smiled, touching Frank's arm. "Darling, I think it's time for us to have that talk." Frank nodded, his expression serious but tinged with tenderness. "Jake, come with us. We have something important to discuss." The three walked to an old oak tree at the edge of the property. Frank took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Jake. "What's this, Uncle?" Jake asked, confused. "It's your freedom, my boy," Frank replied, his voice choked with emotion. "You've paid your debt, not just in money, but in character. I believe you've learned your lesson." Jake opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he found a bus ticket and some money. He looked at Frank, his eyes filling with tears. "Uncle, I don't know what to say." Frank placed his hands on Jake's shoulders. "Say that you will live an honest life, that you will take care of your mother and be the man I know you can be." "I promise, Uncle." "I swear on my life," Jake responded, his voice choked up. Evelyn, who had been watching with tears in her eyes, approached. "Jake, your mother is waiting for you at the bus station. It's time for a new beginning for both of you." Jake hugged Frank and Evelyn, sobbing with gratitude and remorse. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." As Jake moved to gather his few belongings, Frank and Evelyn stood under the oak tree, holding hands. "Do you think we did the right thing, dear?" Evelyn asked. Frank smiled, looking out at the horizon. "I believe so, my love. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting someone go and trusting they will do the right thing." Hours later, at the city bus station, Jake and Elena boarded a bus headed for a new life. As the vehicle pulled away, Frank and Evelyn waved, their hearts full of hope. Back at the farm, Frank stopped to watch the sunset. His journey had been long and full of twists and turns, but at that moment, he felt at peace. "Shall we go home, dear?" he said to Evelyn, intertwining his fingers with hers. Evelyn smiled, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. "Yes, let's go home. Our story is just beginning." And so, as the couple walked back to their home, the sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, symbolizing not just the end of a day, but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter filled with love, forgiveness, and the promise of better days ahead. I hope you enjoyed this touching story. If you connected with the characters and their journeys, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your interaction means a lot to me and helps me continue sharing these moving stories with you. I'd like to sincerely thank you for following along. Your presence and support mean so much to me. Every subscription and like motivates me to keep creating and sharing these narratives that touch our hearts. I invite you to stay tuned to the channel so you don't miss our next story. I'm sure it will be just as engaging and emotional as this one. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next story.